Welcome. I'm Eric Galonick. I'm the Executive Director at the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center, and we're gathered tonight for our July monthly meeting of the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center. Uh, we have, as a membership organization, we check in and share what's happening uh, coming up in this next month, and we have to look forward to. And we have our featured presentation tonight with Dr. Gonzaba speaking about Michigan and the gay guides. Really looking forward to this program. And at the History Center, our mission is to preserve local history and inspire learning to inform and improve our community. The Saugatuck-Douglas History Center began as the Historical Society in 1986. We're a volunteer-run, 700 plus member strong organization that saves and shares the stories of Saugatuck-Douglas. We're really fortunate to have a broad support across our region, and from the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. We've also received support from Michigan Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities for our project, Century of Progress, an LGBTQ timeline, history of Saugatuck and Douglas. And we have special support for tonight's program, sponsored by West Shore Aware. We're also supported by the Allegan County Community Foundation in the work that we do. Most importantly, thinking back to the nature of our 501c3 History Center, we rely on our members in everything that we do, both in financial support through memberships and for all the countless volunteer hours that go into all of our programs and projects. We've got a number of things coming up in the next few weeks that will just continue to build over the summer. The first of these is Artistic Talk. Next Tuesday will be in person at the Garden in the Schoolhouse in Douglas, Michigan State Parks along the West Michigan Lakeshore with Chris Byron and Tom Wilson. They've been favorite presenters in the past. Their 1959 Roadshow and the Green Book program that they did virtually last summer. So do come check that out. More information on our website and on our email. We've also launched a new program this year called History Center on the Road. This is a program highlighting exciting historic places in our community, field trips where invitees, attendees come together in unique spaces for an exclusive view of the area's historical richness. The new evening program includes wine and cheese paired with an informal bite-sized history tour or talk. Places to discover, rediscover include the Cold War era radar station at Mount Baldhead, which you see the drone view there. You get to see the radar site without climbing the 304 steps to the top. And we're also headed to the Dorfeld Mansion and the creative buildings and landscapes of the Oxbow School of Art. The first program begins next week on July 22nd, and you can find out more to register on our website that you see at the link there. Mark your calendars as well. This has been well over a year and a half in the making with COVID, but Labor Day weekend, we will be opening a Century of Progress, the exhibit at the Schoolhouse, the timeline history exhibit of LGBTQ history in our community. So that will open with a special preview, ticketed preview and VIP preview option on Friday, September the 3rd. And then we'll open to the public on September the 4th. So we really encourage you to come and check that out. You can read more on our website and lots more information to come. Tickets are available for that preview party, so share with your friends and reach out if you have any questions about that. It's fitting as we prepared the timeline and as we invited Dr. Eric Gonzaba to present to us tonight on his Mapping Gay Guides project. I thought I'd just highlight one detail from the timeline, the Century of Progress timeline, which features the Damron guides, which we use as part of our research. And one of these sites, the Blue Tempo Bar and Jazz Club, which was a mixed gay straight club operating through the 1960s and early 1970s. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about Saugatuck and the Damron Guides, and about the Damron Guides specifically from Dr. Gonzaba. He teaches at California State University, Fullerton. He teaches courses on the history of race and sexuality in America. I'm going to stop my share here if you want to start yours, Eric. I was really pleased to learn when I reached out to him to invite him to present here and join us virtually that he is a fellow Midwesterner as well as a fellow Eric, and he has a Michigan connection in Dearborn, Michigan, but he received his bachelor's degree at Indiana University in 2012 and a PhD in American history at George Mason University in 2019. He's been supported by grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Point Foundation, the Elton John AIDS Foundation as well. He currently serves as the co-chair of the Committee on LGBT History and Affiliated Society of the American Historical Association. And we're thrilled to have you here with us, Eric, and I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I guess good evening. It's good afternoon here in California. Thank you to everyone for coming out on a Wednesday evening in July. I know there are plenty of things you all could be doing on a Michigan summer evening, so it really means a lot for you all to log on and to hear this chat about LGBT history. It's a real honor to be with you all today and to get to speak at the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center. I want to start off by thanking everyone who made it possible today, especially Eric, for that really kind introduction. Now, it's really a great pleasure to be with you here virtually, back near where I spent a good chunk of my life, as Eric just said, in Michigan. Despite my proud Texas parents, I'm definitely a man of the Midwest. I was born in Missouri. I spent my high school years in Indiana, but in my childhood, I spent about 5 or so years in just outside Detroit in Dearborn, Michigan, and that city means a lot to me, and I love going back there and seeing some friends and some family. Although this is a virtual event, I do feel like I'm coming home in some kind of way. So now, as Eric just mentioned, my name is Eric Gonzaba, and I'm super lucky to get to spend the next hour with you today talking about a joint project that me and my partner at Clemson University, Dr. Amanda Reagan, have created called Mapping the Gay Guides. And I'll explain, if you don't know what that project is, I'll explain it today in detail. I'm going to start off my short presentation today talking about the historical significance about what gave rise to our project, and then spend the second half of my presentation talking about Michigan's role in this project, Michigan's role in these gay guides. Now, I know I titled my talk with the word Michigan at the very front, but I'm actually going to save my discussion for Michigan and the gay guides towards the second half of my presentation. And I actually want to begin my talk talking about 3 men who, by all accounts, shouldn't be mentioned in a chat about gay or queer history. 3 men who ostensibly weren't gay themselves and likely didn't have a huge clout of gay supporters. And as our nation is just about 6 months into a new presidential administration, and I'm speaking to residents of such an important quote unquote swing state, and as a Californian, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that we don't get the pleasure of that label of a swing state. Let's look at 3 presidents in the middle of the 20th century to see if we can learn something about the rise of gay culture, and then later, to the topic of today's conversation, the rise of these gay guides. So I'm going to ask you to begin my talk, I'm going to invite you all to join me in my time-traveling DeLorean from Back to the Future. That is a 35-year-old movie reference, so anyone younger than me is not going to understand that reference. We're going to get into our time-traveling device and head to 3 cities in 3 different decades. I first want to stop in our nation's capital in the 1950s, then head south to the Big Peach of Atlanta in the 1960s, and then finally we're going to end up in my introduction in the 1970s in my favorite city in the country, Philadelphia, near some famous landmarks like the Liberty Bell, Independence Hall, and Four Seasons Total Landscaping, right? So let's first head to DC in 1957. The Oval Office is occupied by the stern President Dwight Eisenhower, a former general. And in 1957, his administration is dealing with a host of challenges, including pushing through a Middle East foreign policy plan, protecting African-American students at Little Rock Central High School, and keeping an eye on the supposed threat of communist infiltration of the federal government. And yet, likely unbeknownst to Ike, just yards away from his presidential bedroom, he could have likely looked out those White House windows that overlooked Lafayette Park and not realized that within the thick bushes and overgrown trees were likely a few, if not dozens of gay men gathering to find companions and sex. Lafayette Park, after all, was one of the most popular cruising grounds for homosexuals in the 1950s, but such outdoor activity was quite risky as police had long targeted gay men for public and yes, private homosexual contact for decades. After all, homosexual sex and sodomy was illegal in most states around the country in that day. Heck, even cities like DC banned same-sex dancing into the 1970s. And to give you an example of just how bad arrests were in the park outside of the White House, Lafayette Park, in the early 1950s, police arrested over 1,000 citizens a year in Washington, DC, a sizable chunk of that coming from Lafayette Park. And those being gay men. Now, for as depressing as that story is, excuse me, actually, before I get there, I'm going to actually tell you one more thing about this site, because I have a picture of some here. Now, one man arrested in that park and deemed a, quote, sex pervert in 1957 was the person you actually see on your right of the screen, which is why I didn't want to I'm kind of giving away the lead of my story. Now, this man on the right side of your screen was an overly opinionated yet compassionate New Yorker. He had served his country in the Second World War in Europe, and in the 1950s, he found himself employed at the Army Map Service of the United States. Now, his arrest in Lafayette Park in the 1950s, in 1957, contributed to the firing of that job at the Army Map Service, as the Eisenhower administration had a strict policy of not employing openly homosexual people in their ranks. But as I said earlier, as depressing as that story is, that man's dismissal would actually light a spark in him. And that man, as history would come to know him, that man's name, Frank Kameny, would go on to be one of the most consequential leaders of the homophile, the early gay rights movement, and of the larger LGBT rights movement in the United States. And 52 years after his arrest, Frank Kameny would stand side by another American president and receive a pen that marked a memorandum that banned LGBT discrimination in federal employment. Once again, standing just 100 yards from the site of a so-called sex pervert's arrest. Now let's leave the 1950s for a second and the 2000s, I guess, the Obama era, and head to the early 1960s. It is the middle of the presidential re-election campaign of 1964, and Lyndon Baines Johnson has come to the prominent Atlanta hotel, the Dinkler Plaza, to give a speech in one of the hotel's many ballrooms. And in that speech, LBJ famously proclaims, "The New South is here." Now, the speech definitely had political importance, especially for the leader of a party who was hoping to consolidate its Southern base, all while trickily supporting African-American civil rights. But it's unclear whether that sort of politics was on the minds of men and women having cocktails and beer and wine and hors d'oeuvres at the hotel's fancy Alibi Lounge. Like Eisenhower, LBJ was probably not aware that in a few rooms over from his speech, gay men were likely gathering at the Alibi, known in queer travel guides as a place for Atlanta's gay men to meet one another. That's right, smack dab in the middle of a popular Southern hotel was a queer bar space, unknown by straights, that was frequented by what they would call deviant homosexuals. Just feet away from where LBJ was proclaiming a new South, gays at the Alibi Lounge were proclaiming another thing in Georgia, a new gay South. Now, finally, we head north to my favorite city in the country, Philadelphia. The year is 1976, and President Ford is trying his best, although not doing a very good job, of trying to rid his party from the stain of the Watergate scandal. Following his October debate with Georgian Governor Jimmy Carter in Center City, President Ford's motorcade takes an unexpected drive down Spruce Street. Now, again, likely unbeknownst to President Ford, and you see there's kind of a pattern going on of presidents being aware that they're constantly in the midst of homosexuals, right? The motorcade was driving straight in the heart of the emerging neighborhood of Philadelphia, where gay bars and restaurants and bookstores and bathhouses sat. Spruce Street was also the most popular gay cruising street in the city, a part of which local gay men affectionately labeled the merry-go-round. And gays and lesbians were a bit taken aback when the president's motorcade and the president himself was freely waving at male couples and lesbian couples holding hands, and gays who were seated on the steps in the city blocks at him. According to the local press at the time, one self-identified, quote, Spruce Street queen spun around when the president's limo slowly drove past, waved at the 38th president and asked him, "Did you give it to him, Prez?" And Ford, ever so gracious, just smiled and waved at him. Now, all three of these presidential gay run-ins, so to speak to the emerging gay landscape of the middle of the 20th century. Following decades of horrific homophobic discrimination and abuse, gays and lesbians across the United States began moving from their hometowns to larger cities and coastal meccas, and began creating the first real neighborhoods and spaces that catered to their interests, and that, they hoped, could form a sort of protective barrier from them and the hostile straight world around them. All across the United States, from the Castro District in San Francisco to Montgomery, Alabama, gays and lesbians began making and remaking spaces to find one another for friendship, for camaraderie, and yes, for sex. But these emerging spaces weren't even across the country. That is, how open a bar or restaurant could be known as a gay space depended on where one lived and where one was visiting. How could gays and lesbians navigate and find one another in such a topsy-turvy world? Excuse me, I want to actually go back real fast. One way that me and my project partner from Clemson, Dr. Amanda Reagan, argued that they did this was using what we called gay travel guides. Basically, these books that were published beginning in the 1950s and the 1960s that listed spaces that helped gays and lesbians beginning in the middle of the 20th century find spaces that would cater to them. This is very similar to the African-American Green Books you may be familiar with. There was a famous movie about them that I believe won the Academy Award for Best Picture a few years ago. It helps African-Americans navigate their way in the Jim Crow South and the Jim Crow North to find places that were going to be able to serve them, places that would be safe for them to stay overnight, hotels and whatnot. And this is what typical, I gave you an example of the Green Books, what they look like here. But this is a typical kind of gay guide here. The ones on the top images are from the Damron guides, which we use, which I'll explain in a second. But there are many different types of gay guides. One of the earliest ones is called the Guild Guide. Later on, there are going to be ones called the Gay Yellow Pages. There's going to be a couple published in the 70s called Places of Interest. They were a huge market, part of a larger print culture that I'm going to discuss here in a second. Now, to give you some examples of these listings, here are some of the listings that we found in the gay guides of sites we just talked about. The Dinkler Plaza Hotel in Atlanta, Lafayette Park outside the White House, and of course, Spruce Street, or as the gays called it in the 1970s, even to the 1990s, the merry-go-round. P.S. Gay men, like lots of marginalized communities, constantly like to rename places kind of on their own terminology. In Philadelphia, the merry-go-round is next to Schuylkill River Park, which is what a lot of gay men affectionately refer to Judy Garland Park, right? The star of the film whose backdrop adorns me now. Now, there were and are different sorts of gay travel guides that began in the 1950s, but by far the most famous and prolific of these guidebooks are the ones we use in the Mapping the Gay Guides project, and they're known as the Bob Damron Address Books. And the Bob Damron Address Books contain lists which are broken down by city and state of LGBTQ-friendly establishments, and they were meant to help those traveling the country seek out friendly spaces, and they become an indispensable tool for Americans, for especially gay Americans, for decades to come. Now, as a quick side note here, my team and I have been working on this project for a couple of years now. And yet, although we talk about Bob Damron, founder of the Damron Guides, a lot, we haven't actually, until very, very recently, ever seen a picture of him. And luckily, just a few weeks ago, we finally found a photo of the elusive Bob Damron. And so you all are the second group I've talked to, other than a couple of my students and one other talk that I gave recently, to actually see a picture of Bob Damron. So I'm very excited to show you. I'm kind of obsessed with that big 1960s, 1970s collar and that big, thick mustache. Just very cool look. Now, anyways, before I go on, I want to spend just a quick minute noting that these gay guides did not come up in a vacuum. They are part of a much wider gay and lesbian print culture that was developed by gays and lesbians themselves beginning in the 1950s. Gay publishers began disseminating all sorts of publications, from gay newspapers and newsletters, from lesbian pulp novels, physique magazines, pornography, and yes, gay travel guides. Now, these publications were one of the major ways queer people began to form identities and communities all across the country. But this effort was immensely dangerous. Most of this print culture relied on the US Postal Service to deliver their publications to subscribers across the nation. And yet federal law and the US Postal Service itself, its own policy, forbade the distribution of, quote, obscene materials, including almost any material that dealt with the issue of homosexuality, even in a clinical kind of way. Editors and distributors would, could, and did get sued, fined, and even jailed for their participation in this print culture. Now, I've included on your screen a photograph of Eisenhower's Postmaster General, Arthur Summerfield. He's on the top right of your screen, who ordered the United States Postal Service to add these cancellation marks, you can see on the bottom of your screen, to all first-class mail that he deemed was obscene, including any literature or letters or photographs that involved gays, or in the words of Postmaster General Summerfield, perverts, right? And by the way, just as like another quick aside here, Postmaster Summerfield was a very weird dude. Beyond his homophobia, historian David Johnson has written extensively on this, but I want to give you one example of just how odd and kind of quirky Summerfield is. In 1959, he pushes the federal government to begin investigating to see if they can start transmitting mail, not through planes or through ground transportation, but through submarine-based Regulus missiles. And the space that was intended for the warhead was to be replaced by over 3,000 letters at a time. And despite one test flight, the idea never takes off. You get it? Takes off because it's a rocket. I throw in jokes. They don't always work. I apologize. Now, thanks to court cases like One versus Olson and later Manuel versus Day in the 1950s and 1960s, led by brave lawyers and plaintiffs, the Supreme Court eventually rules that the writing or pictures of homosexuals was not automatically obscene and thus could be sent through the mail. And following these rulings, really, really important set of rulings, this new gay print culture flourishes across the United States. And the US Postal Service thus becomes a hugely important communication network for gays and lesbians, especially for queers who lived far away from the coastal gay villages or safer urban havens, right? The mail was a lifeline for gays who were living in my hometown of Corydon, Indiana, for gays living in Dearborn, Michigan, for gays living in Tuttle, Idaho, right? Who don't have access to, gay bookstores like you're gonna find in San Francisco or LA or New York, right? Now, the Damron guides, which have been in print since 1964, make up the main source of the project that I'm going to describe to you in a moment. And so I want to explain what this project actually is to start. And for those watching on a computer, I more than give you permission / encourage you to explore this site while I'm talking. You can find it on mappingthegayguides.org. I'm kind of an interactive person, so I'm not offended in the slightest. Also, I can't see you, so you can get away with murder right while I'm talking. So when you get on this site, and I'll show you, if you're not going to get on it, I'll show you in a second. From this site, the main way we envision how to use this site is through a map feature. And this web app layers digitized data from the Damron guides, and I'll explain what I mean by data in a second, to show change over time. And this kind of map app that we've created contains a series of filters that allows users to interact with the data from several different entry points, including narrowing the data down by city or state, choosing to display only certain categories of establishments, I'll explain that in a second, and visualizing change on a date slider. But instead of explaining to you, let me just show you what the site looks like, at least some of the kind of the bedrock of the site. If you're on it right now, this is kind of the main interface when you hit the map icon at the top. On the bottom, as you see on the map, are dates, and each one of these dates represents a different physical guide. So what my team has done is we opened up each of the guides and we went through every single American listing in the guides, and we create a data set. And so if you want to look at only information from the 1965 guide, you can go to 1965, or you can look at 1974 or 1976, right? So right now, for instance, on your screen, on my screen at least, you can see we're looking at the 1965 guide. There are 785 locations in the first iteration of the Damron guide that was published in 1965. you see that you're looking at now at all the listings of the 1980 guide. So basically I have moved that cursor all the way over to 1980. So we go from 785 locations in 1965 to 4,461 locations in the 1980 guide. So, doing math off the top of my head and not preparing before this at all, that's a wink, wink, 468% increase in the number of listings from Damron's first guide in 1965 to his last, well, from the current guide we have completed in 1980 in just 15 years, and pretty incredible growth, right? Now, the other way to use this map is to filter this data through what we call amenity features. And I've shown you where these amenity features are. Now, these features are from a lettering coding system that the Damron guides initially and still do use to provide more information to the reader about just what kind of sites contained within them, or the kind of clientele that attended these sites. Now, this coding system changes throughout the years, but as you can see on the right side of your screen, this is what a typical explanation of listings what that appeared on every single one and still appears on every single one of the Damron guides. So basically, every single listing has the name of the establishment. So let's say we're talking about a Saugatuck, Blue Tempo. I'm going to show you that in a second. It'll say Blue Tempo, and then it'll have a couple of letters next to it. It might have H, which means that's a hotel. It might have B or beef, that's an African-American establishment. And these are kind of categorized in different ways. You can see there's breakdowns along age. You can see older, more mature crowd, very young collegiate types. There's breakdowns on class, pretty elegant, raunchy, downtown, professional or business, and even gay subcultures, Western, country, uniform, leather. We also have the letter B, which is the only racial designation in the amenity features listed in the Damron guides, at least in the early years. A B was the sole letter just denoting race, and it stood for Blacks predominate or Blacks frequent. And for those of you who might not be familiar with all these categories, our team under the methodology section actually breaks down each of the letters to try to more fully explain what each one of these means. Now, I'm sure all of you have lots of questions that I want to get to and talk about kind of what this data means to us. So in the interest of time, I'm going to conclude my introduction of what the Mapping the Gay Guides project is by showing you some of our initial findings by doing this project. To be sure, when my project partner, Amanda Reagan, and I sat down to first figure out the parameters of Mapping the Gay Guides, we had lots of interest in figuring out whether looking at the guides in a macro level, right? So not just opening these guides and reading them individually, like gay men were doing in the 60s and 70s, right? We wanted to see if we can view them by stepping back and viewing all this data from kind of a step back on a macro level, whether it could tell us something more about the social and cultural history of queer people beginning in the middle of the 20th century, right? And despite us only being in the very early stages of our project, we do think that we see some major benefits at looking at the gay world using these helpful, if not always reliable sources like gay guidebooks. And I say not always reliable because using the Damron Address Books means having to come to terms that they're imperfect, right? Damron, for instance, the founder of these guides, he hailed, at least at the initial time that he first published this, from San Francisco. He was a white gay man. And so we expected that at least at the very early iterations of the Damron Address Books, and maybe even later, they would be focused, these guidebooks would be focused about the experiences of white gay urban men like Damron himself. In fact, we know this because in the early editions of the guide, Damron personally visited nearly every single site that he listed in the initial guides. Now, by the 1980s or even late 1970s, that was impossible. There's 4,000 sites. There's no way that Damron was going to be able to go to all 400 sites. But early on, he felt it was very important to only document the sites that he himself saw and could enter, right? But still, even with these imperfections, which I can talk more about in a second, these sources give us a window, albeit imperfect, to sites sometimes ignored by the mainstream public, right? Could they tell us perhaps of a more vibrant culture outside the major queer meccas of places like San Francisco or New York, right? Now, I'm going to start off just with some very basic findings, some of our spatial findings, which we'll admit are still very rudimentary. Right now, our team is still doing some cleaning of our data set, and most of our analysis has really been on a quantitative basis. But spatially, we do have some interesting findings. Here are maps comparing the total number of listings from 1965 to 1980, the darker the dot being the more sites located in that location. The names of the cities means that they're in the top 10 locations in terms of raw numbers. member in that given year. Now, these maps are a little misleading as they're using Damron's classification of city, which means Manhattan, for example, does not include bars like in Brooklyn or in Staten Island, which is not really fair for New York, right? Because we think of New York City, we think of all the boroughs. But still, 15 years after the first publication, you see some real growth in these guides in places like the South, in the Plains, and the Midwest, which we think are really interesting, right? We think that Damron gets the gay world better as his guides get larger and larger. Now, one amenity feature that really interested our team was the letter M, denoting establishments that were mixed and or for tourists, beginning in 1965. Now, throughout the early 1970s, Damron slightly changes the explanation of M to mixed crowds and eventually to mixed or some straits by the late 1970s. And this designation largely marked establishments that had a significant, if not a majority clientele that identified as straight. Damron likely used the designation of M to mark sites where gays and lesbians faced less hostility than at otherwise straight venues. So gay visitors, for instance, to Florence, Alabama's Pit Grill in 1980, which likely stayed open late for those enjoying an evening out, likely you weren't going to find scores of gay men, dancing to jukebox music and waving rainbow flags in Florence, Alabama in 1980. Rather, what the M meant was that gays would face less harassment there than at other late night establishments or restaurants for whatever reason, right? Now, our team is immensely curious about whether this mixed label was more common in places like the Midwest or the Plains or the South, because it had to be, right? There were less uniquely gay spaces than in other parts of the country. Long stereotyped as overly religious or moralistic or ignorant, regions like the Midwest or the South are largely perceived by citizens as being homophobic and intolerable to queer life. And this characterization is not necessarily unwarranted, right? For example, Mississippi voters approved a state constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage by a whopping 86%, right? So we can't act like every single area of the country is, equally tolerant of queer people. 11 years later, just before the Supreme Court marriage equality decision in 2015, Pew polling found Southern support for same-sex marriage at 44%, the lowest in the entire country. As you can see from the map provided here, we see mixed locations really start helping provide greater representation, though, for queer people that weren't captured in early iterations of the guide. So the M label is really, really important because it makes the idea of queer space not so exclusive to major metropolitan or urban centers, right? Now, I want to turn to some interesting findings on race before I get to Michigan for a second that my team has been recently working through. Our team wanted to know if we can learn anything about race and the making of queer communities in the middle of the 20th century. But I said earlier on, using the Damron Address Books to understand the racial atmosphere of the United States is kind of difficult. It's proven difficult. For one, at least in the periods that we've covered so far, from 1965 to 1980, Damron, like many people of his day, largely understood race as kind of a black-white binary, right? And among the many letter-based amenities that Damron used to classify listings, the only explicit racial classification was the letter B. He does talk in these early guides about Latin spaces, his terminology. Eventually, in the later 80s, he'll talk about Hispanic spaces. And in the 90s, he's going to start opening up to Asian spaces, Native American spaces. But up until 1980, he's only really talking about Black and white spaces and uses that letter B to denote Black queer spaces. Now, Damron first uses the letter B in 1970, so 5 years after his first publication. And the letter B, which originally stood for Blacks Predominate, changes in 1972 to Blacks Frequent. And that's how the label will be used into the 1980s. Now, Damron leaves us no methodological information about how he designates listings. We don't know why he decided to add B to some places, why he decided to add M. There's no, he didn't go in and count the number of lesbians at a bar to deem it a lesbian space, right? So we don't know why he did it or what was his purpose in adding this information. The publisher, Damron, likely included the letter B at bars or restaurants for the benefit of African-American gay men who sought to find spaces that they could be in the company of other African-Americans, right? Additionally, it's possible that Damron aimed the classification at white gay men looking to find African-American companions, kind of a sort of fetishization of Black bodies. It also might have served to warn perhaps racist white gay men not to attend certain bars or restaurants, right? Whatever the reasons, which we don't know for sure, the use of this designation allows us to explore some elements of places that cater to Black gay life. Now, one way our project is able to make sense of the wider attitudes, gay attitudes towards gay African Americans, is to look at our data from a macro level, like I talked about earlier on, and to pay attention to trends. For an example, one facet of Damron's classification system of relevance concerns Damron's designation of safety concerns. And the most common amenity feature used to denote safety concerns was the letters RT, which began showing up in guides in 1972 to designate, as you can see on your screen, raunchy types, downtown types, often hustlers. Now, RT was likely Damron's early attempt to highlight establishments that the guide's primary readership would deem less than reputable, places that were what Damron would consider dingy, places you wanted to avoid, right? The Damron guides link sex workers, hustlers, right? Downtown types, likely people who lived in the inner city, to places of vice and crime and deviancy. Of the over 34,000 listings from the 15 years that we currently have digitized so far on Mapping the Gay Guides, Damron has only listed about 4% of places as RT, right? So they make up a very small percent of places that Damron thinks are raunchy places, right? But listen to this, ready for this? Of all of the Black listings on Damron's data, half of them, nearly half of them, 47% are also listed with RT, right? So it's much more likely if a place has RT or a place has a B, is likely also going to be labeled as RT, as raunchy. Now, the Damron Address Books, whether intentionally or not, we don't know, seem to promote the idea that Black gay spaces were more often spaces of lewd and dangerous conduct, right? Here, I think we get a pretty classic example of racial formation, right? Whether or not Damron intended it, he tends to put African-American gay spaces and conflates them with places where people should avoid that are raunchy, places you want to desperately not go to, right? Now, I would be remiss if I gave a talk to Michigan historians and history lovers without actually talking about the gay guides and what they might tell us about Michigan's LGBTQ past, right? So I want to explore that a little bit with you, but I also want to take your questions, so I won't spend too much time. But let's take a kind of a deep dive into Michigan while we're at it. Now, on your screen is a map of Damron's listings on the very first year of the Damron publication in 1964, or in other words, 1965. The way the Damron guides work is that they're published a year before the year they say they are. It's kind of like buying a Honda Civic, right? You can buy the 2022 Honda Civics, but right now it's still 2021, right? Damron's 1965 guide, he actually published in 1964. So you're actually looking a little ahead in the future. Now, as you can see, the 1965 guide lists 27 Michigan locations. Perhaps not that surprising, almost half of those listings are in the Detroit metro area alone, a city that has something like 1.6 million people in the 1960 census. You can see on the map, your hometown of Saugatuck is listed with just two locations, the Elms Hotel and the Blue Tempo Bar, which I'll talk about in a second. And I want to return to both Detroit and Saugatuck in a moment, but just for comparison, this is what 1965 looks like, and this is what looks like in 1980, the last year our team has currently digitized. And you can see in that 15 years, you really have an explosion of listings in Michigan alone. We went from, what did I say early on? How many listings early on? I said 27 listings, now to 124 individual listings, some in Kalamazoo in the south of the state, all the way up to Marquette, Michigan, 450 miles to the north in the Upper Peninsula, right? And if Damron was your only guide, or your only gay guide, if you will, to be more specific, you couldn't deny that Michigan has a vibrant LGBT community beginning in the 60s and 70s, and certainly has a rich queer past, right? But as historians and history lovers, maps can only tell us so much about the lives of gay, lesbian, bi, and trans Michiganders, right? We have to push deeper. And for my last kind of few minutes that I have left, I want to delve a little bit just into what I see about Michigan's queer past by looking and using the Damron guides as a starting point in my research. And hopefully it tells us a lot more about Michigan's rich queer history. Now, just to bow down to the gods of chronology for a second, let's return to the swinging 1960s, and I wanted to return to Detroit. Now, since I love primary sources, looking at original documents, here on your screen on the top left is a picture of the actual Damron guide listing some of Detroit's gay spaces in 1965, and I juxtaposed this to what the listings look like on our site to give you a sense about what our project is actually doing. You can see we are literally going line by line each year of our project and are turning each of these classifications, each of these lists of spaces into a separate data file so that future researchers can kind of dig through this data in a much easier way, right? So instead of just perusing these guides and looking at them individually, our team and hopefully is allowing other researchers to be able to see them and these locations at a much more macro level, right? Now, what I love about this page in the 1965 Damron guide for the Detroit that we have is that you can tell this is a used, worn copy, right? You can tell this was definitely used by somebody, probably a gay man, who felt the need to write in another entry of a spot that he felt he probably visited or he heard about while he was at another Detroit nightlife space or a bar or whatever, right? And sometimes we find copies that are just like it. Sometimes we find copies where whole listings or whole sections of listings are crossed out. Maybe the person tried to go to that spot and it was no longer there. The bar had closed or something here. And while like crossed out entries can frustrate our ability to make our site, I personally think it's actually really awesome, right? It's a brilliant example about how these guides were used and they were manipulated, but most of all were of huge importance to a generation or more of gay men who really valued them and needed them to survive this kind of topsy-turvy world that I talked about earlier on. You also see a picture on your right of your screen of one of the Detroit locations listed, the Gold Dollar. On the entry, on the actual physical entry of the Damron book, we get a sense of those classification letters, right? The M in 1965 stands for a mixed location, one where straight people are going to show up, tourists are going to go there. We get the letter S, which in 1965 told us there were shows there. And if you read Damron's classification that year, he means drag shows. So we know there's drag shows happening in 1965 at the Gold Dollar. And we get an asterisk, which is Damron's way of saying that it's one of the city's most popular gay venues, right? So anytime you see an asterisk in the guide, it's telling you, or a star, it's telling you that he thinks of it as prime importance. Now, why did I pull of all these locations in Detroit? Why did I pull this one out of my hat? Well, I just love this photograph that I found of the Gold Dollar, and it kind of highlights and confirms one of Damron's classifications, right? On the window, we see the words show bar, but more revealing, we get the writing of the words female impersonators, which confirms Damron's listing, right? How amazing is that? Now, obviously, we don't know the full history of the Gold Dollar or this site, but our early research suggests that it was more of a space for straight people to laugh at female impersonators. But insofar as this venue was a space of gender bending and likely an introduction to many, many people to the world of drag at such an early year, remember this is 1964, the middle of the 1960s, it's such a fascinating space to ponder what role this one space played in this 1960s community, right? Now let's look westward to a place nearer and dearer to our viewers' hearts. The two listings in the 1965 Saugatuck guide on the beautiful Lake Michigan. P.S. as an annoying aside, my first encounter as a child with open water was Lake Michigan, and I have such good memories like swimming in it as a child. But it was really a problem to go there as my first beach because I assumed that all water was fresh water. So my parents eventually take me to the coast, like the Atlantic coast. I was really disappointed to find that water is not all fresh water, that it's salty. I don't know why I brought that up, but I just love my Lake Michigan. But anyways, back to our beautiful Saugatuck. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1965 guide, Damron only lists two Saugatuck locations, the Elms Hotel, which I was able to find a picture of here from a postcard on your picture on the bottom left of your screen, and the Blue Tempo that Eric talked about at the beginning of this presentation. We know it's a bar because from the image that I stole from the site, from y'all's site, it even has the words bar next to it on the photo, which is really helpful for historians, right? Now, I'm not an expert on Michigan's history, but the lovely folks at the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Society tell me that the Blue Tempo, as Eric just said, was one of the region's first gay bars. It was a famous jazz spot that openly serve gay people, which is quite rare in Michigan at the time, as liquor laws basically forbade people, especially bars, from serving gay and gender nonconforming people. And by the way, this is not picking on Michigan. States and cities all across the country, including in California, New Jersey, and New York, all have liquor laws that forbade, in the 1960s into the 1980s, forbade the serving of queer people, gay people, lesbian people here. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the Stonewall bar is rated. Stonewall is serving patrons and gay patrons without having a liquor license. Stonewall has no liquor license in 1969, the site of the famous Stonewall riots, right? Now, at first glance, the gay guides can't tell us a lot more about the Blue Tempo, but I do think that Damron's side note about the space and the wider Saugatuck area is revealing, right? As you can see, Damron notes that, quote, an interesting beach lay beneath the Blue Tempo. And as we all know, and as I tell my students who are learning how to write, the word interesting is probably, and ironically, the least interesting word in the English language. But since as historians, we have to pay attention to even the minute aspects of our sources, I still think the word is interesting. We should probably change it to significant, right? For one, I think it points to Damron's bias as a coastal San Francisco gay. So many of his descriptions of places outside of major urban centers, and especially outside of gay meccas like the Florida Keys or Fire Island or San Francisco, right? He often litters these sites with language that just feels sometimes patronizing, especially to places in the South or the Midwest, or at least it does to me, a Midwesterner. And perhaps I'm being too hard on Damron in this instance, but I think that describing a beach that was frequented by Michigan gay men who lived in a society that was vastly different from Damron himself as interesting just feels, I don't know, like condescending or something, right? Oh, excuse me, I'm skipping ahead. But I was saying, it feels condescending in some ways. But I also think that it tells us even something else about 1960s. I actually think Damron's use of the word interesting tells us a little bit about the clever and careful word choices that he's forced to use, especially in the early iterations of these guides. Remember, there's a reason that the early Damron guides look so non-conspicuous. You don't see very many images of half-naked men. You don't see the word gay being used very often. You don't see the word lesbian used. Definitely don't see the word queer, a slur at the time, right? And this is intentional, right? There's a reason why the early Damron address books shy away from covers that depict these pages as having anything to do with homosexuality. Damron continued to use coded language to discuss places where gays would and could congregate and meet. And this coded system allowed gay men to travel and explore the world, and the gay world, if you will, with minimal risk of exposure, especially if those guides got into the wrong hands, right? Their family members, their wives, the police, right? Now, by the 1980 guide, the Saugatuck area added another 20 or so listings, likely proof of a much more open and expanding gay culture on Michigan's resort beach front, right? Now, I found Damron's side note about one of the 1980 locations pretty significant. It read that readers report that the Saugatuck lodges could stand a good cleanup. And this tells us a lot, I think. For one, it tells us just how much Damron is relying on the active readership to change and craft these gay guides by the early 1980s, right? You can tell it that people are actually reading them because they're telling him what listings are fair, which listings are good, which listings are bad. And these letters and these phone calls that are coming into Damron are probably affecting which kind of designations, what kind of letters these sites are actually getting. And in doing so, are shaping how gays are seeing their culture and the world around them in those periods. And I think it gives us proof that these gay guides are actually being used in places beyond the gay havens that I constantly have been talking about, New York, San Francisco, places like that. More evidence, I think, that Saugatuck is literally and figuratively becoming a part of the gay map. Now, lastly, before I end this quick recap of some of the early findings on Michigan and the gay guides, I want to stress one more thing, and it kind of goes back to my discussion of Frank Kameny in DC in the 1950s earlier on. For as much as these guidebooks can tell us a celebratory story of gay culture, I mean, when looking at Saugatuck, I didn't know anything about the Blue Temple, and I was like, wow, what a cool space. I can't wait for my students to explore this place and what it means to the rising queer community of Western Michigan, right? For as much as it can tell us kind of exciting and brave tales of gays resisting, homophobic culture, I think it's really important to think and step back and think about how much these guidebooks aided a generation of men who felt like they couldn't, for whatever reason, access the many places that are listed in the guidebooks, right? We already know And we already discussed about how these guidebooks didn't always show places that catered to people of color, men of color, right? But I think on the flip side, they did in some small ways try to aid men who couldn't be part of a wider gay community, who openly sought out gay restaurants or gay bars, right? Some men, for family reasons or for job reasons, or perhaps just personal reasons, for personal sexual preferences, whatever, for lots of reasons. Some men felt that they desired to meet men in spaces outside of commercial establishments, right? Some men had no interest going to gay bars and whatnot. They sought fulfillment, be it via camaraderie, romance, or sex, in public spaces away from straight eyes and straight scrutiny. But as you can probably guess, this was quite risky, not just in homophobic society that did and continues to demonize gay people, but in a society that actively sought to crack down on homosexual sodomy and sex. And these guidebooks included listings pertaining to Michigan, both aided men to find sites that they could explore their sexuality and meet others like them. But even more importantly, as I argue here and looking at these guides, they give warnings to men about the potential dangers of certain sites, right? Places, AKA places to avoid, right? Take, for example, a rest stop outside of Kalamazoo, Michigan. Rest stops, due to their kind of transient nature, were often popular spots to meet like-minded men. But as the guidebooks tell us, such activities were highly dangerous, just like they were dangerous for Frank Kameny in 1957. If you were interested in cruising off a rest stop 8 miles from Kalamazoo, Damron warned you that it was, quote, sure suicide, plagued with massive arrest, aided by security camera surveillance. And who knows how many men suffered with police arrest at police arrest at this spot. But also inversely, as I try to stress here, who knows how many gay men were tipped off and avoided the spot because of the guidebooks, right? Perhaps then dodging potentially devastating legal or personal or familial consequences. And before I continue, I might kind of conclude here, a huge shout out to the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Society and the History Center for their 15th anniversary this year of the GLBT History Project, which they're aiming to document the region's queer past. It's such an important project and one that I think will shape how historians and history lovers come to think of the Midwest and all the gay history within it, which is just ripe to explore, right? So to close, I'm sure there are a few of you asking what's next for Mapping the Gay Guides. Right now, our team has only been able to offer just 15 years of data. And remember, the Damron Guide, the reason why we use the Damron Guides is that they're the most long-lasting of the guides. They're often the ones that later iterations or contemporary iterations of gay guides would copy, and sometimes literally Xerox pages of Damron and include them illegally in their books. And the Damron books begin in 1965, and they go all the way to 2020. And we believe it's probably the last year they're going to be in physical print, but that's why we decided to use them. But despite having access to, what is that, almost 50 years, right? Over 50 years of data, we only have the first 15 years actually digitized right now. But thanks to a very, very recent, AKA like just a month ago, recent support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, our team has now just received a 3-year grant to expand our site and listings on the site all the way to the year 2005. And that's about another 25 years of data. And we hope that with this new data added, you'll start to see much more representation of sites, especially places like in Michigan, and to highlight the rich queer past that places like Michigan have. So as I close here to take your questions, I want to stress that my team on this project like to think of Mapping the Gay Guides as the start, and I stress that, the start to many future projects into the queer past. And Mapping the Gay Guide strives to use digitized but previously under scrutinized source bases like gay guidebooks to help map gay life in the United States and challenge ingrained assumptions while also raising new questions about the way gay Americans negotiate space in the 20th century. And we hope that our visualizations showcase the expansive nature of gay life in the United States and allow us to ask new questions about identity, like religion, and class, and race, and gender, by analyzing Damron's categorizations of gay establishments. We look forward to adding newer versions of the guides past 1980 to track the development of gay sites during momentous times in both queer and national life. For example, how does gay space change during the momentous AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s? How does gay space change after the 2003 legalization of sodomy across the United States via Lawrence versus Texas, right? Or national events. How does gay space change during financial crises or other world events, right? It was an honor today to get to talk to you and introduce you to Mapping the Gay Guides, but I really look forward to right now, which is answering your questions. And with that, I'm going to open up to the floor, Eric.
That's great. Thanks, Eric. You all should be able to unmute yourself or turn on your video, and we've got a good size group here. So feel free to ask a question. Just you can introduce yourself and ask a question.
I'm sorry. And it's okay if you don't have questions. I can talk about anything, Eric, or I don't have to talk about anything. So
that sounds great. I'll jump in with, oh, go ahead.
Is Bob Damron still alive?
That's a great question. Bob Damron is not still alive. So I believe, it's funny, I just was looking at his obituary recently. I believe he died in 1990, complications of HIV/AIDS. So no, he's not still alive. And that's actually a question. It's called the Bob Damron Address Books. He eventually sells the guides in his corporation, if you will, in the mid-1980s. I believe, I'm not trying to give you bad information, but eventually it lands in the hand of a lesbian, I believe openly lesbian woman named Gina Gatta, who still owns the publication today. And what she does is she makes it much more lesbian, gay, and eventually bisexual and transgender friendly. It's so important that she feels that lesbians need their own guides, and she creates the Damron's women's guides as well. And so some of my, not in my department or anything like that, but there's some historians who are actually exclusively working at women's guides. Because eventually what happens is she decides that the Damron guide should focus on men or mostly male spaces, but the women's guide should focus more on lesbian spaces. It's a great question, Michael.
I had a lot of questions as you were talking. It was really just fascinating to take us through that, Eric.
Sure.
What do we know? Do we know much about the publication history, about how many of these books were published over time, and what the distribution is like? Like, were they, where did you find copies of these?
Sure.
Yeah.
That's a great question. So we don't have the physical numbers. We don't know exactly about yet. We think we can get that. We think we can locate some data about how many were being published. I will say, I'm going to answer your second question in a second, but I will say, like, as somebody who initially used these, the reason why this project started was I wrote a dissertation before, obviously, to get my PhD about gay nightlife in DC, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. And while I was interviewing dozens of gay men in these cities to try to make an argument about gay nightlife, they constantly mentioned new bars to me, and I'm trying to keep track of it. And I realized I just could not figure out how to keep track of that. I needed like some kind of like list of spaces in all my cities. And I refer to travel guides as kind of the way I could like find kind of a general notion of what was open at what time, right? And why did I bring this up? Well, you were asked, about the number of them. What I found when I started my research in about 2014, 2015 for this dissertation project, I would go online and I could order some of them. I could order them on eBay and whatnot, and they were selling for 10, 15 bucks. Something happened. I don't know if it's my project or something's happened the last 5 years. These are highly collectible items, or we have somehow thought of them as high collectible items. Some of these early editions of the guides are going for thousands of dollars. So any of you have these in your closet or something, hold on to them. They're extremely high. I will say they're widespread. I don't know exactly the number of them, but I do know Damron's reach. So I told you earlier on that the number one way the gay print culture survived was through the US Postal Service. Damron did not necessarily rely initially on postal subscriptions. That would be a later thing in the 70s and 80s. Initially, what he decided to do was target both local bookstores, so gay identified bookstores, or bookstores that were known for carrying radical publications in some cities, right? Or he would target bars themselves, right? He would say, I'm going to send you 20 copies of the book, disperse them, send me a cut of these, right? And we know this a couple ways. We know this because we have some records of his sending them, but he actually, Damron, being the ever clever businessman that he is, he calls out businesses that don't pay him back for the guides he sends out in his copy, right? So he'll say, the Gold Collar didn't do this, but let's say the Gold Collar, he sent books to the Gold Collar to sell. He would put in the 1975 edition, Gold Collar, a great drag bar, P.S. haven't sent me the $500 they owe me, right? So he says in the guides, he calls out in publications, and like he has a loyal following who use these guides that will pressure them to like, hey, you're not paying the guy that we use this guy all the time. You should pay him, right? So that's one of the interesting networks. It tells us how important these sites are, though, too, right? They're not only places where men are going to find romantic partners, not only going to have a drink at the end of the long work week. They're incredible sites of distributing information, right? Of getting guidebooks, getting gay newsletters, and learning about your community. That's why physical space in the gay community is so important, right? And why the collapse of neighborhoods across the country, like today, right? The collapsing number of gay bars and lesbian bars across the country is really, I mean, some people don't think it's a big deal. They're saying it's okay. You don't need gay bars anymore. I still think the communication network that gay commercial sites had was of extreme importance, and that you're going to lose that. And to give you one example of this, I was just thinking about it and looking into it a couple of days. When I was born, which we'll ignore what year that was, just say a long time ago, there were about 200 lesbian bars across the country. The number is under 30 now. Right. So, I mean, the gay ecology of our country is really collapsing. And that could be for good or bad reasons, but I think it's something that we as historians and scholars and history lovers should think about what that means when we're losing important spaces of our identity.
What's happening to the guides after 2020? Are they going online, or are they just
That's a good question. So the guides right after, thank you for that. I think that's Michael. That's a great question, Michael. So what happens during the internet age is that, I mean, these guides basically become obsolete, right? If you want to know what's happening, what gay spots you can go to, you can go on the internet now, right? Well, right when the internet begins, kind of the usefulness of both gay space, but also gay guides kind of gets obsolete because of the internet here. Damron is kind of on the forefront of how to fix this problem. I say Damron, the corporation. They create kind of a subscription service online. So you can pay something, I'm going to get the number wrong. You can pay like $100 a year and have access to a constantly updated list online. That's not just the United States, it's all over the country. And eventually the Damron guides, the physical guides, will also have listings all over the country. And that works for a while, but eventually, like I said, the internet makes everything free, right? So they even paying for subscription service becomes obsolete for that. But yeah, they're online now. I'm unsure, I'm doubtful that business model will continue very long.
What about overseas?
In terms of listings or?
Well, it seems to me that the use for these things is diminished in the United States because gay people in America can travel around pretty easily now, but there are a lot of places in the world where it's not as easy.
Right. It's funny. I don't have a good answer to that. I do know that Damron's idea of gay travel guides takes off, especially obviously in Western countries that are having queer social movements in the 20th century. Places like Denmark and most of Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, they create iterations of the guide. They use a lot of Damron's inspiration about how to kind of list and categorize stuff. I know there are some early types of doing that in places like, some parts of Africa and some parts of Asia. But the risk of getting caught, it's one thing to be jailed for a couple of years. I'm not trying to pinpoint a certain area, part of the world and, pinpoint them as more homophobic or less homophobic in the West. But I'm saying that I think there is the cost of becoming exposed is such a higher scale in some parts of the world that you don't see a gay print culture flourish like you do in the West. And so no, I don't have great evidence to suggest that this is something that's copied in other parts of the world beyond Western democracies. But I will say, just to add more to Michael's point, we talk about the Damron guides. Damron eventually finds out very early, in the early 1970s, that gay men and lesbian women, I talk a lot about gay men. These guides were initially geared towards gay men, but eventually others, including lesbian women, started using them because they do include lesbian spaces and trans spaces and whatnot. Damron learns very early that queer people are travelers, right? And so he starts listing safe spaces in Mexico and the Caribbean and the British Virgin Islands and eventually Europe. And eventually he creates city guides that are, I shouldn't say he, the corporation creates city guides unique to places like Amsterdam and Florence and Europe. And, so it's just really interesting that this is one of the stories that I gave you is a story of gay print culture. What we're also, I think, we're excited to explore as we get into the 1980s and 1990s is how these guides relate to gay travel culture. Because that's a little different, right? Of course, we use these guides as survival tool early on. But we think that the use of this changes considerably as the 80s and 90s approaches. And we're going to see much more focus about, what these sites mean, not in terms of can you be safe, but what they can offer you as, gay travelers, which I think is a little bit of a nuance there that we haven't yet explored.
The Elms Hotel in Blue Tempo, I saw there was a map with a couple of pins in them. Is that where they were located?
Yeah, so that's a great question about how it works. So yeah, we try our best to list, actually I'll try to, I don't have it open. What we try to do is we try to list the location as close as we can to what the address initially said. There are a couple caveats to that. So sometimes the address, because of the changing nature of physical space, right? The address no longer exists. There's a new highway that was built, right? And destroyed that whole property. And there's no way to, so if we can try to find the exact address. If we can't, we try to place it in the place that we think, based on our knowledge, it is. If we cannot do that, let's say it's a space that says it was a kind of a hidden gay space that you had to be in the know to know where it is. It'll say inquire within or acquire throughout the city. We don't try to pretend we know where that information is. Because it's a mapping project, we map it in the generic location that Google says it is. So for instance, if it's Kalamazoo, there's a central location of Kalamazoo, it'll list all of that. However, you can filter that when we don't know an address, you can filter that information out. It's one of the options under the search feature here. And also because we try to be as transparent in this project as possible, one of the things you're able to do is you're able to see if that location was a verified Google location. So when Google read the address, was it able to find it? If it was something that we found, or if we could not find it at all, we give you all that information so to be as clear as possible. Now we often get letters from people or emails from people saying, oh, you got this address wrong, or Damron was wrong or something. And we really appreciate that. We love what we do is we keep tabs of that and we thinking about how this project is going to expand, because what we hope to do is right now we're just working on getting all this data available to researchers like you all and trying to do whatever you guys want to do with them. If you're a local travel guide, adding gay spaces to your local travel tours or whatever, right? But in the second iteration, guys, we want to learn more about these spaces, right? So we want to be able to build a site where, if you went to the Blue Tempo, you can write, oh, I remember this bar and it had X, Y, and Z, and it was open to this, and it discriminated against, and upload pictures and much more usable, kind of a community-driven kind of social media kind of site. But right now we have to actually build the apparatus to get us to that point. And I was going to say one more thing about that. I forgot your question. But we often get, people want to correct us. What we try to do right now is we try to stay as close to the original Damron guides as possible. And so one of the things we found out very quickly is that Damron makes a lot of mistakes, right? He puts a bar in a place that's 2 blocks from where it should have been, right? And he might correct himself next year of the guide, but he might not. We try to give as much, as clear information on the front end as the way Damron presented. So if you're looking up an address in our guides, when you see a listing, you're seeing exactly what Damron said. You're not seeing our interpretation of it. Now, later on, what we do is we keep notes on the back end of our site for researchers to use that we keep all additional information when we find out. For instance, we discovered very recently, because of a talk like this in Houston, we discovered that Damron got a whole city block basically wrong of addresses. They lied to him. Bar owners said all these bars existed that didn't exist, but they're still on our site, right? Well, they're still on our site because Damron said they were there, right? And we're not, who are we as historians to tell people this, So what we try to do is keep it as close as possible, but when people inquire, then we can fix it. But we want this kind of to be a research tool that people can discover stories like that, like the wrong Houston addresses, right?
Great, thank you.
Of course.
One really specific question, Eric.
Sure.
You mentioned early on that most of the early entries and the relatively small number of entries that are in the first years in the early 60s, that Bob Damron likely traveled to those places himself.
Yeah.
Personally traveled. Is there evidence or is it your opinion that he may have come to Saugatuck or traveled to the Midwest?
That's a great question. I do think so. I think I think what happened is able to, this is a great project. I think he finds himself able to afford, at least early on, the first couple of years, mass travels. Now, I'm not convinced. What I have read is that I tell the story that he's personally visited all these places. that is a lot to visit 700 places, you know, before 1964. It's a lot. So maybe it's bully on me to like think maybe that's a stretch. But I do think he probably traveled to as many of the regions of these countries as he can and talk to informed people, right? And I think it's impossible to create this book without talking to a lot of informed people. So I think he probably went to Detroit, probably traveled to places like, I actually think you asked about Saugatuck. It's beginning to become a known, at least in the Midwest, as a queer place by this time. Not yet what it's going to be by the 80s and 90s. That's kind of like the premier destination for this area of the country. But I do think that he probably knew it's kind of up and coming space, and he likely, I can't guarantee it, but he probably likely did encounter some of those spaces there. Did he always, and I actually think, we don't have evidence of this just yet, but his selection of places is really interesting because we know there are gay bars in many cities across the country that he does not include in his initial guide, these are popular gay bars. So they're either that I don't think he intentionally misled them, but I think maybe he really did not go visit them and didn't feel comfortable adding until he knew personally that they were a gay space. So no matter what, even if he didn't go to Saugatuck, I think that he definitely knew somebody who did go there and knew precisely the kind of clientele that was going to those locations that were listed.
That's fascinating.
I don't know.
Sally, question?
Oh, sorry, Michael. Oh, sorry, Sally first. Sorry, I apologize.
Go ahead.
Oh, how about Michael? Then Michael, sure.
I'm wondering how many very small, obviously a lot of gay life got focused in very large cities. Saugatuck, I don't know if you've been here, it's a very small town.
Sure.
I'm wondering how many places there were in the country as early as I noticed there were like 21 listings in 1980. Town of like 1,100 people. That's a lot.
Right.
I'm wondering how many places there were that were anything like that by that time.
Well, so it's important that's a great question. That's something that a lot of people are constantly thinking about too, because they'll look at their town, they think, like, for instance, people are always shocked at the number of gay bars in Baltimore. When I tell them the number of gay bars that are happening in places like Orange County in the 60s, the birth of the Republican Party and like the modern Republican movement in the 60s, right? I think part of the end designation is really important here, is that, Damron's early iteration of what gay space is not, I think, what we think about gay space now, which we tend to be places that are, carrying the rainbow flag, right? What Damron's really trying to do in this guide here is a survival guide, at least in the early iteration of this guide, right? Places where you're going to feel comfortable holding hands, maybe not even holding hands, comfortable going and possibly meeting other people, right? Other gay people. Like, there's no way that, the Dinkler Plaza was hosting gay pride parades in 1960, right? But we know that, like, it was a place for gay businessmen to go and they could meet each other for the first time, meet other gay men. They're not able to do in other spaces, right? So I think the nature of gay space is just different, right? It's Central Park, right? We don't think of Central Park as a uniquely gay space. There are Waffle Houses in Indiana that are listed in the Damron guides. Do people automatically think of Waffle Houses as gay spaces? No, but I think it's really important to think of that, like, I think what these guides have changed my opinion as a historian is, like, what does it mean to be gay, and what do we think about as gay spaces? It's a radically different one than we think about today. So to answer, like, what, small spaces, it's not uncommon, but I think your region of the country is the most surprising, in the sense that, like, to me, it's one thing to look at San Francisco's data and be like, of course there's 50 gay bars in 1975, right? But to look at Michigan, for me to look at Michigan and see almost 200 spaces in 1980, that's a lot. Like, that shocked me, and I'm from the Midwest, right? So, like, just thinking about how gay spaces and how queer people survive and thrive in places that we think of as uniquely homophobic, it's going to change how we approach gay spaces and queer spaces in our books, but also to the wider public, and how to teach. Instead of teaching gay spaces a kind of a essential and essentialist kind of thing, a thing that never changes, we're learning that sexuality and how sexuality can change space is really adapting over time, right? I don't know, that's really fascinates me. But
these places are tolerant more than what we would think of today as gay.
Right. Yeah. Tolerant's a great word, and tolerant and maybe even too strong a word, right? Who knows how much the Waffle House is tolerant, right? But a place of more tolerant, I guess, than other spaces that they're going to find, right? And by the way, like, it makes sense that the Waffle House is more tolerant in my home state of Indiana. It's the place at night where, like, people, you think of places, I mean, the gay bars around the country develop in the, the turn of the 20th century. You later think of as gay bars. They develop in places where people are already doing things, who already consider themselves outcasts of society, right? Gamblers, places of vice, people who are, drinking too much. These are places where you can openly explore sexuality you can't do in, inner city New York in 1910. These are the places that gay men are going. This is the place they're finding safety. And so I actually like that word. Tolerance is a good word, even if it's a little too strong, right? Yeah.
Oh, Eric, can I ask?
Yes, Sally.
I had read that Bob Damron was a sales representative for a liquor company, and that was why he was traveling all over the place and able to gather his information. Have you ever heard anything like that?
You know what's funny? So that's a great question. I have heard about that. Bob Damron is an elusive figure, so much so that I'm like, I mean, this is I've literally never announced this, Sally. So congratulations. I'm in the work of thinking about a book about this man because I have read widely conflicting things. I call him a businessman on our site, but I'm not for sure what he is. I'm not for sure if he's a liquor salesman. I've heard about that. I can't confirm it by any means, and I did not see that in his official obituary. I've heard that he was a long-running bartender, other pursuits as well. So I don't know. I'm not for sure, but I have heard about that, and that would make sense, right? He's able to go to so many places and be involved in a nightlife world, the nightlife world being the most important aspect of the gay world in the 1960s and 1970s. So it makes the most sense, but I don't want to be of all the people who could probably give you a straight answer for that, I should be the one to do that, but I'm not comfortable saying yes. It sounds plausible, but I don't know. I'm not for sure. Lucky enough, though, so Bob Damron's from a generation, I'm Eric, if you're trying to close this off. I will say Bob Damron's from a generation that unfortunately for different reasons, the AIDS crisis, just the generation, how ages progresses. He's in a generation that, his peers are slowly no longer with us. And so to record his story, which I think is an incredible story that has not been documented, we're kind of in a race against time. And so if you ever meet anyone on this, that knows Bob Damron or knew people who knew Bob Damron, incredibly important. I would love to know about that and to interview them. I've gotten in contact with a few people who knew him personally, but other than those people, the most I get are people who knew him, from other people, which is kind of sad. So.
Yeah. Well, elusive figures make for some of the best history. So yeah, we'll look forward to following your work, and I think you've definitely stirred all of our imaginations for this story, and to explore your site as well, mapping the gay guides, and start to do some of that analysis and make some things happen. So I want to thank you again, Eric, for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us here. We will make this program available online as well, so please let others know also after the program that they can hear this phenomenal program about LGBTQ history and about our Saugatuck area.
And Eric, I just want to say I'm jealous of all the incredible programming coming up at the History Center. So I'm jealous I cannot be there to see it all, but I encourage everyone to take advantage of it because it sounds absolutely incredible. So thank you all.
Thanks much.
Thank you.